Hey everybody, thanks for tuning back into Otram's YouTube channel. Today we've got a 2004 Lexus LX470 with a noisy front differential. Luckily, Toyota still carries new, like brand new in a box front differentials for these at a price that was attractive enough that it didn't make sense to buy all the individual pieces and put all the labor in to rebuild the front differential. So we're going to swap that in here in just a minute. Before we got into that, I also wanted to mention that we now have membership to the channel. So if you'd like to help support the Otram channel and making more videos like this, you can join up on the top of the Otram homepage. Joining gives you earlier access to videos before they come out. And if you join on the upper tier, it allows you to join the live chat question and answer probably once a month. I haven't decided how many chats we're going to do yet, but probably going to start at once a month. But anyway, with that all said and done, let's get into actually repairing this. Before I go ahead and raise this up, I'm going to undo these two wires and this bracket right here so that I can feed these down so that when I take the spindles off, the ABS lines are loose. I always forget to take these off before I raise the truck up. So we're going to do those now. And then we're also going to do the ones over here on the passenger side. One of these is the height control, and one of them is ABS. It's easier just to undo both of them and let them flop down. I'm going to do that off camera because I can't get my tripod in here to do it, and I can't handhold this and pop those off. So I'll be right back. Okay, so we're on the driver's side front, and I've pulled those wires down from up above. And as you can see, one of them comes around and up and through a bracket and ends up over here. So we're going to go ahead and undo that harness. Come on. Like that. So those are separated. And then there's a 12 millimeter bolt up here. One here on the control arm. And that one's a little strip, so we're going to come back to that. And then we're going to separate the... Yep, actually, I'm going to lower you down. You can't see me. Let me get a little pry tool, and we'll finish getting that one out. And then down here, this one holds the brake line onto the bracket. We're going to pull that one off because we're going to end up slinging the caliper out of the way. And then we're going to take this one out of the side of the spindle. So that we can completely separate out the ABS harness wire. And that way this is all loose and separated. We're going to take this spindle off, and you don't want any chance of any tension on this wire because the filaments in here are really small, and you can stretch this and not show any damage to the outside sheathing, but the actual cable inside will break, and then you'll have weird ABS issues. So we'll set that off to the side. And then I'm going to take the two 17 millimeter bolts out that are holding the caliper on. And I don't have the GoPro with me to get you guys a good view of the back here. But there's just two 17 millimeter bolts that hold the caliper on. So I'm going to loosen that top one, loosen the bottom one, take those out. And it's easiest if you loosen them both first before you pull them out. If you don't, sometimes the whole caliper will spin when you're trying to loosen it, when you've only got one bolt left in there. So I always loosen them both first. Come on. And sometimes it helps if you wiggle the caliper a little bit to free that up to get that loose. And then we're going to use a caliper hanging hook because you don't want any weight hanging on your brake hose. And we'll just hang this from the height sensor bracket so that the caliper is well supported. And then I'll move you around front because we're going to take the upper control arm, the tie rod, and the ball joint loose. And actually, while you're here, I'm going to take this dust cap off. And luckily, or handily, somebody's already been in here and dented this up. So we've got a good starting place. There we go. And then we got to take the snap ring off the end of the axle shaft so we can slide it through. And these parallel opening snap ring pliers are awesome for this. You can, pull the snap ring, dance with it, and you don't lose it. I love these pliers. And they're Wild or Willed, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. I'm sure there's other people that make them. These are awesome. But there are CVs loose, so we can pull that through when we're ready. We'll move the camera, and I'll bring you back. So now we need to start taking the cotter pins out. And I like to just use a pair of diagonal cutting pliers to unfold them and then pull them through. We're going to undo the upper control arm, the tie rod end, and the lower control arm. I'm going to grab a long 19mm wrench to break the upper control arm nut loose. It's hard to get an impact in here. I'm going to take this nut most of the way off, but leave some of it on to protect the threads and give something to support this when we break that friction joint. And then a 22mm here on the tie rod end. Same thing, I'm going to take it most of the way off, but leave it sitting a little bit. And then a 24 under here on the ball joint. And same thing. I'm going to leave it just a little bit on there. And then you'll notice a flat spot up here on the top. And you can just kind of keep hitting that until that pops loose. And then same thing, I'm going to hit the lower spindle down here until the lower drops off. There we go. And then the tie rod end. There we go. And they make press tools to make this easier. They don't really fit on the 100 series or LX470 well, so I usually just end up using the hammer method. But now everything's loose. We've got our axle shaft loose. You can just flip. I'm going to undo my lower nut completely now. And now is the fun part where everything's hanging off this nut. I'm going to take that out. Everything's going to drop. We're going to fish our wire through because I somehow looped it through the brake line. We'll fish that through. Then we can take the whole spindle off and set that aside. I'm gonna put my nut back on there so I know where it came from. Same with the lower ball joint. That's actually feeling like it's a little bit loose. Let me reposition you, and then we'll pop the axle shaft out. It's kind of hard to get you a great view under here, but if you look where the end of the differential housing is, you'll see the CV coming out of it. You can put a pry bar in there and pop the axle shaft loose and pull it out of our way. And you're likely going to have some gear oil drip out of the end of the housing here. And I should mention, I've already drained the differential and pulled the skid plates off from under here. And I've also been doing the same procedure on the passenger side as I've been doing the driver's side, because we have to take both sides apart. So I'm going to go get the other axle shaft out, and then I'll reposition you, and we can actually start dropping the cradle to pull the differential itself out. Next up, we're going to need to take the front drive shaft loose of the pinion. And while we're under here, I guess I should mention that we're replacing this because it had noise and it got drained a couple of times with metal in the oil. And you can see it's been leaking from the pinion seal here, which likely took out the pinion bearings by running them, without as much oil as they needed. When you were driving it, you could hear the pitch change when you went from drive to coast, which is usually loose pinion bearings because the pattern changes on the gears as the pinion moves in and out with throttle. So that's why we're swapping this. So we're just going to get our swivel on here, 14 millimeter. And pop these out. And if you are on the ground doing this, you won't be able to just reach up and spin this because it's going to bind through your transfer case. You're going to want to put the transfer case in neutral first. Since I've got all the wheels off the ground, the back ones are just spinning when I'm moving this around. Oop, that was handy. That one went in my pocket. And a lot of times, these are way more difficult than this to get to come loose. Gonna give that a little tap. To break it loose. And what it feels like, a lot of people, when they start to hear driveline noise, their first instinct will be to add grease to the slip joint. And I don't know, you probably can't see it in the video, but the drive shaft, the drive shaft is extended a little bit here at the slip joint because there's so much grease pumped in here. It's made it like a hydraulic piston and has pushed this out. So there is resistance to pushing this back. That resistance is putting sideways pressure on your pinion bearings and your transfer case bearings. That is not good for the life of the bearings. There should not be enough grease in here to hold this. This one's not super bad because I can actually push it back enough to get it loose. So you'll have some that you won't be able to move it at all. And I'll take the Zerk fitting out, especially on a rear one, not so much on the IFS. But you'll take a rear one out, and when you take the Zerk fitting out and it releases the grease pressure, the actual truck will lower some from the hydraulic pressure relaxing, which is just crazy. And then while we've got the camera set up here, there are two 17 millimeter bolts that hold this cross member on. We're going to zip those out. And there's 2 more matching just out of frame here on the other side. And I don't know if you saw the cross member kind of jump down a little bit when I took that last one loose. The driver's side axle mount is on this cross member. So while the cross member's loose, we're still hanging by the driver's side of the diff. And we've got a mount at the front and then another mount right here that is a 19 millimeter. And there is a nut up here on the top. I'm going to need a bigger wrench. And I'm not going to take this all the way loose right now because I want to support the differential before I pop that all the way out. But I'll bring it around to the front before we do that. Okay, so I've swung us back around to the front of the truck, and this is the driver's side axle mount that's hooked to that cross member. So we want to zip it off. And there are nuts on the inside, which are fun. It's probably easier to take it loose at the joint down here and then change this bracket over when we're ready to put this back in, but here we go. And with those bolts out, our whole cross member and everything comes out. So this side is loose. I stuffed rags in the ends of the housing to try to keep it from dripping so much. It's not really helping, but it's better than nothing. Okay, so I've got my transmission jack in place, holding up the front differential. You can do this without a transmission jack, but it is so much easier with one. And then I can take this front bolt on the front mount and pull it out. Pay attention to which way these washers are. And then there's another one that's going to come loose up here. We had a truck in recently that somebody left this washer out when they put it back together. And the bolt ended up just ripping the center of the bushing through. And the whole differential was just laying in the skid plate. And they had a tremendous clunking noise going down the road. So pay attention to the order of everything. And then I'm going to come around to the back here. The bolt that we loosened up earlier, this one's counterpart, I'm going to go ahead and take it out now that the diff is supported completely. And same thing, pay attention to where the washers are. And also pay attention to which bolt is which. They are different lengths. The back one is the longer of the two, and it has a nut on top, where the front one, the nut is captive inside the cross member. So now, you can grab this and slowly start lowering it down, and you're gonna get, oh, this one's not attached. You'll see a differential breather coming down as I'm lowering this. A lot of times this will be hooked to the frame and will hold you up while you're trying to lower everything. And then there's some rubber bushings that sit on top of the isolators that you just want to, keep track of. So I'm going to take this off the trans jack and swap the new differential on here, and then I'll bring you back. Okay, so through the powers of movie magic, it is tomorrow. The new diff is up on the trans jack, and I've washed the parts that we're going to reuse, and I have a head cold. So if you hear me sniffling, sorry about that. So the first thing we're going to do is put this rear mount back on. I took it off camera, because I decided I should wash it before I put everything back together. And I'm going to put a little bit of red Loctite on each of the bolts, because I don't want those coming loose. And we'll just stick our bracket on there. And get those started. And then these two bolts get torqued to 58 foot-pounds. So we can do both of them without dropping this off the jack. And then this is the bracket that was on that cross member. We're going to bolt it back on. And same thing, I'm going to put some Loctite on the bolts. And then these get torqued to 137. And hopefully I put that on right way around. Otherwise, we'll find out in a minute. There we go. And we can roll this all back over. There we go. And then I took the diff breather off to clean that up. And that just pops back on with a 12mm headed bolt right there. And then I also took the isolators off. They are different front to back, so I marked the back one with a zip tie before I put them in the parts washer. And this one just goes back here on the rear mount. So I'm gonna roll this back under, get it jacked up into position, and then I'll bring you back. And as you're jacking it up, you just wanna make sure that you don't hit the breather pipe on anything, and just, kind of guide it up so it doesn't get bound on anything. And I find it's easiest to start with this rear mount because it's actually got a nut. So you're not trying to fight and line up threads while you're pushing this up there. And I put a little Loctite on the bolt. And I've got my washer on here. We're going to loosely hang that for a minute. And then we can come around to this one on the front side. And the trans jacks a little bit in the way of that washer. But there we go. And we'll loosely put this one in. You want to be careful with this one because it's a captured nut in here. You do not want to cross thread that. So get that really well started by hand before you use any tools on that. And now, since we've got those two loosely hung, we can move the trans jack out of the way. And we can come in and put the cross member back in. Actually, do it the other way. Put a dab of Loctite on there. I'm just going to start that nut. I'm going to take one of the bolts and a lady slipper. Well, there we go. I'm going to jam the lineup bar in there loosely. Then I can feed a bolt through from the back. And grab another one and stick it through the other side. And there's that one. Take my lineup bar out. Put my fourth one in. And then the washers all go on the side with the nut. And I'll put a little more Loctite on the nuts. And then these get torqued to 58. Go. Then we're going to tighten this one to 137. And then 137 for this front mount also. and 137 on the back one. And it helps if I remember to put the wrench on top when I'm going to snug up the back one. And I had the wrench kind of wedged against the downpipe. You want to make sure that you pull that loose before you final torque it, because it's real hard to get that wrench loose when you've put 137 foot-pounds against it. There we go. So now our diff is all securely mounted. We can come back around and put the drive shaft on. Let me move the camera and I'll bring you back. Okay, now that we're back under here and we've got the diff all bolted up, we can start putting the drive shaft back in. And let's see if I can get it to squish back far enough. And it is not going to cooperate because there's too much grease in there, so let me pull this zerk fitting out real quick. And again, there shouldn't be enough grease in there that it hydrolocks the drive shaft. We shouldn't be able to move it freely just from taking that zerk fitting out. And then I've already put some blue Loctite on my drive shaft bolts. I'm going to stick those through, and then a washer and a nut. And you'll want to start all of these loosely. Otherwise, the register ring on the drive shaft will likely bind as you try to put them all in. And then I'm just going to use the impact to snug those up before we torque them. And then these get torqued to 59 foot-pounds. And I'm bracing my wrench against the bottom of the oil pan flange to keep it from rotating. And then I'm going to just go around and check them again to make sure they were all seated. go. And we can put our Zerk fitting back in. So now we're all done under here. We can put the axles and knuckles back in, so let me move you around. Okay, so now we can move on to putting the axle shafts back in. And normally you would grease the inside of the seal before you put the axle in. Handy enough, Toyota pre-greases these on the new differentials, so we don't need to. But you do need to look at this dust flange, sorry, this one, the inside one. Double check that it's still straight. A lot of times when you go to pop the axle out with the pry bar, you'll catch that and it will bend and you have to straighten it up. And then this snap ring that's on the end, you'll notice that there's an open end to it. It works best if you have that open end facing down when you go to put the axle shaft in. And then you can kind of just thump it in there. You'll hear it click. And then you can look underneath, to make sure that you don't have a giant gap. And then I like to spin them a little bit just to make sure I don't have any dust flange dragging before I put all of this back on and can't get it back out. So let me reposition the camera and then we'll put the spindle back on. And I should mention, before you put the spindle back on, there is a needle bearing here in the back of the spindle. Now is a good time to take some fresh wheel bearing grease and repack that bearing, because there's no way to pack that once it's on the truck. Okay, so now we've come to my least favorite part of the job, putting the spindle back on. This is a heavy, awkward chunk and not fun to put back on. You're going to want to have your lower control arm and upper control arm nuts ready and somewhere you can reach them while you're putting this on. You're going to feed the axle shaft into the hub. While making sure the go. And then once you get that bottom stud fed through, if you kind of push the knuckle sideways, you can jam it so it doesn't fall back off while you put the nut on. And then you can stick it back up. Make sure your wires aren't hooked between the CV. I'm going to let that flop down for just a second. And then you take a pry bar and stick it above the control arm. You can wiggle the axle shaft in there. And then pry the upper control arm down and get that nut started. And then we'll put the tie rod end in too. And then we'll kind of zip everything up. 19 on the top, 22 on the tie rod. And grab the wrong size socket. Go. 24 on the bottom. It's easier to snug them up with an impact, especially if the ball joint's loose, because the stud will try to spin. So doing it with an impact and spinning it faster, a lot of times will make it easier to get in. And then you want to make sure that your axle shaft has actually come through enough that you can get to the snap ring. So our upper ball joint to steering knuckle is 81 foot-pounds. And then we want to look to make sure we've got a cotter pin hole lined up, and we do. And then tie rod stud goes to 53 foot-pounds. And we're going to need to go a little bit more to get that stud hole to line up. There we go. And then the lower ball joint's 118. And these are nice. They're pretty much landing with the holes lined up to put our cotter pins through. And then we're just going to take cotter pins and stick them through the castle nut and the hole. And then bend them around to lock them in place. Go. And we just need one more for the tie rod end. And there's that guy. So now our control arms and our steering are torqued. Let me bring you around here and we'll start putting the brake stuff back together. Okay, so we're finally getting down to the home stretch. We can put our snap ring on here. And when you put it on, you want to make sure that it'll spin in that groove so you know it's all the way seated. Then we're just going to take the dust cap and knock it back on there. And then I'm going to take my ABS wire and loosely route it. And I'm trying to do these at the same time so we don't run into the issue like we did coming apart where we get things tangled. And sorry, I can't get you a great view of this. We kind of want to get all this loosely in here so we don't tangle it up in the brake caliper. There we go. Then we can unhook our brake caliper. And slide it back on. Then we can put our last 12mm bolt in that holds the brake hose. And then I'm going to use my electric ratchet just to snug these up. And those are another one you want to be careful not to cross thread because if you mess up the threads in them, you're buying a new spindle. And then we're going to torque those to 90 foot-pounds. And I like to do these twice, you know, since they do hold the brakes on. And there we have it. I've got to go up top and plug my height control and ABS sensor wires back in. And you want to make sure you do that before you turn the key on. Otherwise, you're going to get ABS codes for having that unplugged. And I need to fill the front differential with gear oil. There's a fill plug on the passenger side. We're still waiting on our gear oil to come. So I don't have any gear oil to put this in this yet. So I can't show you that in the video, but I want to go to lunch and finish the video. So here we are. But that was, that's how to do a front differential exchange on a 100 series Land Cruiser or an LX 470. I hope you found that useful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. And as always, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help support the channel, click the join button on the video description. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time.